Here's the uncomfortable truth nobody likes to open with. Americans are not moving around right now, they're voting with their feet. And some states are getting absolutely crushed in that election. This isn't a temporary wobble caused by a bad year or a weird headline cycle. This is structural. This is long term. And it's happening quietly enough that most people don't realize how deep it runs until the damage is already baked in. We're told the story is simple. People chase sunshine, lower taxes, or remote work freedom. Sounds clean, sounds logical, sounds like something that fits on a postcard. But here's the part nobody wants to say out loud. A growing number of Americans aren't leaving because they found something better. They're leaving because what they had stopped working. Not symbolically, not emotionally, functionally. The math broke, the promises expired, and the gap between what these states sell and what they deliver has become impossible to ignore. When millions of people pack up their lives and don't look back, that's not a vibe shift, that's a warning light, and it's flashing across 14 states right now. Be honest. If everything was fine, people wouldn't be leaving in record numbers. They'd complain online and stay put. Instead, they're selling houses, breaking leases, pulling kids out of schools, and starting over somewhere cheaper, quieter, or at least less hostile to everyday survival. This is where the glossy narratives collapse. Because when you dig past the slogans and tourism ads, a darker pattern emerges. High costs paired with declining quality, rising insecurity mixed with stagnant wages, and institutions that feel frozen while real life accelerates around them. Take housing. Everyone knows it's expensive. That's not news. What is news is how many of these exit states crossed the invisible line where housing stopped being a stepping stone and became a trap. Prices didn't just rise, they detached from local incomes. Rent didn't just go up, it started swallowing entire paychecks. Homeownership didn't just get harder, it became mathematically irrational for average workers. And once people realize the numbers don't add up anymore, loyalty evaporates fast. People will tolerate a lot traffic, weather, bad politics, ugly commutes, but they won't tolerate a system that demands everything while giving less each year. And housing is only the first domino. Layer on insurance costs that spike without warning, taxes that rise while services degrade, and infrastructure that feels permanently stuck in "we'll fix it eventually" mode. Suddenly, the daily grind starts to feel like punishment rather than progress. Picture this. You're paying more every year, but your roads are worse. Your commute is longer. Your utilities are unreliable. And the public systems you were told justify the cost feel stretched thin or outright broken. That's not inconvenience, that's erosion. And erosion doesn't cause riots, it causes exits. Quiet ones, relentless ones, the kind that hollow out communities without making a lot of noise. Another uncomfortable layer? Demographics. Many of these states aren't just losing people, they're losing working age people, young professionals, families, tradespeople. The people who pay taxes, start businesses, and keep local economies moving. What replaces them often isn't enough to sustain the system long term. That creates a feedback loop where the tax base shrinks, costs rise to compensate, and even more people decide it's time to go. This is how decline actually happens in modern America, not with boarded windows overnight, but with for sale signs that never come down and classrooms that quietly merge grades because enrollment dropped again. And here's where the cynicism kicks in. These states are still marketed as premium, as destinations, as places you're lucky to live. The branding hasn't caught up to reality. The brochures promise opportunity, while the spreadsheets scream warning. Locals feel it first. They see friends leave. They watch neighborhoods thin out. They notice that the people arriving aren't staying long, and eventually they ask the same question everyone else does: why am I paying this much for this? That's when the exit becomes personal. That's when loyalty snaps. And it's not about politics, despite how quickly people want to make it about that. This is about outcomes, about systems that stop delivering basic value, about states that became too expensive to function and too rigid to adapt. The mass exit isn't driven by one bad policy or one bad year. It's driven by accumulated disappointment, by the slow realization that staying requires sacrifice with no clear payoff. And the most revealing part? Many of the people leaving aren't chasing luxury. They're chasing stability. predictable bills, manageable housing, a sense that tomorrow won't be harder just because today exists. That should scare anyone paying attention. Because when stability becomes the dream instead of success, something has already gone wrong. And this is only the beginning. Because as we count down these 14 states, the pattern gets uglier, the contradictions sharper, and the consequences more obvious. Some of these exits will surprise you. Others will make you wonder how anyone is still pretending everything's fine. Either way, once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. And that's where this story really starts. Let's get more specific now, because this is where the polite explanations fall apart and the real reasons start showing their teeth. When people leave a state in small numbers, officials call it normal migration. When they leave in sustained waves, year after year, across income levels and age groups, that's not migration, that's abandonment with paperwork. And one of the biggest drivers behind this mass exit is something nobody likes to admit because it sounds boring: reliability. Or more accurately, the complete lack of it. Americans are discovering that in certain states, nothing is predictable anymore except that next year will cost more and deliver less. Housing might be the headline, but it's the surrounding ecosystem that seals the deal. Utilities that spike without warning, insurance premiums that jump double digits overnight, property taxes reassessed upward even when home values stall, school districts quietly cutting programs while still asking parents to be patient. You can tolerate one or two of these things. You cannot tolerate all of them at once. That's the breaking point. This is where the lived experience diverges sharply from the narrative outsiders still believe. On paper, some of these states look successful. GDP growth, job numbers, big-name companies announcing expansions, but paper success doesn't pay your electric bill or fix a leaking roof. People don't leave because a state failed abstractly. They leave because their daily life became an exercise in financial triage. Be honest. How long would you stay somewhere if every month felt like a surprise quiz you didn't study for? That's the psychological toll people don't talk about enough. The constant low-grade anxiety of not knowing which expense will blow up next. The feeling that no matter how carefully you budget, the system will still find a way to punish you. Over time, that erodes trust. And once trust is gone, attachment follows. Another major accelerant is insurance, especially in places where risk has quietly outpaced infrastructure. Home insurance, auto insurance, even health-related costs have ballooned in ways that feel disconnected from reality. People don't just pay more, they get less coverage, higher deductibles, and longer wait times when something actually goes wrong. At that point, insurance stops feeling like protection and starts feeling like a subscription you're forced to keep just in case disaster decides to show up uninvited. And here's the kicker. Many of the people leaving aren't broke. They're not failing. They're doing fine by conventional standards. That's what makes this trend so revealing. When middle-income households, professionals, and retirees all start heading for the exits, it's not because they can't survive, it's because they refuse to keep playing a rigged game. They've run the numbers, they've compared options, and they've realized that staying loyal makes less sense than starting over. That's not a moral judgment. It's basic math. Infrastructure decay plays a quieter but equally destructive role. Roads that never get fixed properly, transit systems that feel stuck in another decade, aging utilities patched instead of replaced. When maintenance is always postponed, the costs don't disappear, they compound. And eventually, residents pay for that neglect through higher fees, longer outages, and reduced quality of life. The irony is brutal. People are asked to pay premium prices to live inside discount systems. That mismatch is a powerful motivator to leave. And then there's the labor equation. Some of these states market themselves as economic powerhouses, but the wage reality tells a different story. Paychecks have not kept pace with living costs, especially for non-executive roles. Promotions don't feel like progress anymore, they feel like survival upgrades. You earn more, but somehow fall further behind. That's not ambition killing, that's soul draining. Over time, workers realize that their effort is subsidizing inefficiency rather than building security. When another state offers similar pay with lower costs and fewer headaches, the decision stops being emotional. It becomes obvious. What makes this exodus even more damning is how many people try to stay before leaving. This isn't impulse behavior. It's delayed acceptance. People downsize. They cut expenses. They switch neighborhoods. They commute longer. They try to make it work. And when all those sacrifices still aren't enough, the conclusion is unavoidable. The problem isn't them, it's the place. And once that realization lands, it spreads socially. Friends talk, coworkers compare notes, group chats fill with Zillow links and moving truck jokes that slowly stop being jokes. Exit becomes normalized. That's when a state is in real trouble because cultural momentum flips. Staying starts to feel like the risky choice. Leaving feels rational. And here's where the branding gap becomes almost comical. These states still sell themselves as opportunity hubs, lifestyle paradises, or long-term bets. But residents know better. They see the cracks. They feel the pressure. They understand that slogans don't cover shortfalls. This disconnect creates a kind of quiet resentment, not loud enough to make headlines, but strong enough to empty neighborhoods. The result is a slow bleed that accelerates over time. Fewer people, less revenue, higher costs for those who remain. Repeat. This is the cycle that turns a temporary issue into a generational problem. And we're only halfway through the list. Because the deeper we go, the clearer it becomes that these exits aren't random or emotional. They're calculated responses to systems that stopped working for normal people. The next states on this list push these patterns even further, with consequences that are harder to reverse and easier to ignore until it's too late. By the time we reach this stage of the list, the exits stop looking like individual choices and start resembling coordinated retreats, even though nobody planned them that way. This is where the social fabric begins to thin, and you can feel it in everyday moments that don't show up in economic reports. Empty storefronts that technically haven't closed yet, but never seem open. School parking lots with fewer cars each year. Entire blocks where the lights go out earlier because there are simply fewer people left to keep the rhythm alive. The mistake analysts keep making is assuming people move for upside alone. In reality, people move to escape downside risk. And in these states, downside risk has become unavoidable. The cost isn't just financial, it's emotional. It's the exhaustion of constantly adjusting expectations downward. The quiet resignation that comes from realizing the future you planned no longer fits the place you're living. Picture this. You're not poor, you're not reckless, you did what you were supposed to do, and yet stability keeps slipping further away. That cognitive dissonance wears people down. And when people are worn down, they don't protest, they leave. One of the biggest accelerators here is demographic imbalance. When younger workers start leaving faster than they're replaced, the math turns ugly fast. Fewer workers supporting more dependents. Shrinking tax bases paired with rising service demands. Healthcare systems stretched thinner as populations age in place. That's not sustainable, and residents know it, even if they don't articulate it in policy terms. They just know their town feels heavier, slower, and more fragile than it used to. Add to that the quiet hollowing out of small businesses. When foot traffic drops, margins vanish. When margins vanish, quality drops. When quality drops, people stop showing up. This isn't a mystery, it's gravity. And yet, local leadership often responds with optimism theater instead of structural fixes. Ribbon cuttings for projects that don't address core issues. Marketing campaigns aimed at outsiders while insiders pack boxes. Nothing breeds cynicism faster than being told everything is fine while your lived experience says otherwise. Be honest. How long would you trust a doctor who keeps saying you're healthy while your symptoms get worse? That's what residents are dealing with. Another factor pushing people out is the collapse of what used to be informal safety nets. Neighbors helping neighbors, community organizations filling gaps, local institutions acting as anchors. When populations shrink and stress rises, those networks fray. People become more isolated, less resilient, and more vulnerable to shocks. One bad year, a job loss, a medical issue, a natural disaster becomes catastrophic instead of manageable. That changes how people assess risk. They stop thinking in decades and start thinking in exit timelines. The irony is that many of these states once thrived precisely because of their strong communal bonds. But bonds require density, trust, and continuity. When churn increases, all three weaken. This is also where the "it's cheaper here" argument collapses under scrutiny. Yes, sticker prices may still look lower than coastal hotspots, but total cost of living tells a harsher story. Longer commutes because services are farther apart, higher transportation costs due to limited alternatives, increased healthcare travel because specialists are scarce, more money spent compensating for gaps the system no longer fills, cheap becomes expensive in slow, sneaky ways, and people notice, especially retirees and families on fixed or semi-fixed incomes. They don't need luxury, they need predictability. And predictability is exactly what these environments no longer offer. There's also a cultural fatigue setting in. When a place feels perpetually defensive, always explaining why it's misunderstood, always promising a turnaround, residents internalize that tension. Pride turns into justification. Justification turns into doubt. Doubt turns into departure. This isn't about disloyalty. It's about self-preservation. People don't want to spend their lives arguing with reality. They want to build something that lasts. And when a state's trajectory feels uncertain, even small improvements don't inspire confidence. They feel temporary, reversible, fragile. That's deadly for long-term commitment. What makes this stage of the exodus especially damaging is that it's self-reinforcing. Each departure slightly worsens conditions for those who stay. Fewer customers, fewer volunteers, fewer taxpayers, fewer voices pushing for change. Eventually, even the most committed residents start asking the forbidden question, why am I still here? And once that question is asked seriously, the clock starts ticking. Moving is no longer hypothetical. It becomes a project, a plan, a countdown. This is how states lose people not in waves, but in tides. Slow at first, then suddenly overwhelming. And the tragedy is that none of this happens overnight. It unfolds quietly, politely, almost invisibly, until the numbers make it undeniable. Which brings us to the final stretch of this list, where the exits are no longer about inconvenience or frustration, but about fear of being the last one holding the bag. The next segment isn't just uncomfortable. It's the point where denial finally runs out of room. This is where the conversation stops being theoretical and starts feeling personal, because at the tail end of a mass exit, people aren't leaving for better weather or trendier zip codes anymore. They're leaving because staying feels like a gamble they didn't agree to take. This is a stage where confidence collapses, not dramatically, but quietly, like a floor that slowly gives way under too much weight. What separates these final states from the earlier ones isn't just worse numbers. It's the collective psychology. When residents no longer argue about whether things are declining, but instead argue about how fast you've crossed a line that's hard to come back from. The most dangerous signal isn't population loss itself, it's expectation loss. When people stop believing improvement is possible within their own lifetime, they mentally detach, they stop investing emotionally, they delay repairs, they hold off on community involvement, they treat the place like a rental they're planning to move out of, even if they own their home outright. That mindset alone accelerates decay. Infrastructure becomes a liability instead of an asset. Roads don't get fixed quickly because fewer people complain, and fewer people complain because fewer people expect results. Public services slip from reliable to good enough, and from good enough to hope nothing breaks. Be honest, once you start hoping nothing breaks, you're already living defensively. This is also where the employment math turns brutal. Jobs don't disappear all at once. They thin out. Employers consolidate. Positions stay technically open but unfilled. Wages stagnate not because companies are greedy, but because the local economy simply can't support growth. Young professionals notice first. They look around and realize the ladder they're climbing doesn't go very high, so they leave. Then mid-career workers follow, because without young talent, innovation slows, and without innovation, opportunity dries up. What's left is an aging workforce, carrying systems designed for a population that no longer exists. Healthcare, in particular, becomes a stress point. Fewer providers, longer wait times, longer drives, higher out-of-pocket costs. For older residents, that's not an inconvenience, it's a deal breaker. And once retirees start leaving, the financial picture darkens fast. Fixed income residents are often the most stable spenders in a local economy. Lose them, and you lose predictable demand. Lose predictable demand, and small towns lose their last line of defense against volatility. Meanwhile, property markets enter a strange limbo. Prices may not crash outright, but liquidity dries up. Homes sit longer, buyers get picky, sellers get desperate. Equity becomes theoretical rather than usable. People realize they're house rich only on paper, which is cold comfort when they want to relocate or fund retirement. This is when fear creeps in, not panic, but calculation. Fear that if they wait too long, they'll be stuck. Fear that the exit window is closing. Fear that the people who left early were the smart ones. That fear spreads quietly through conversations at grocery stores, doctor's offices, and family dinners. It's never framed as alarmist. It's framed as practical. We're just keeping our options open. But options narrow quickly once enough people make that same choice. Governments often respond late because the signals are ambiguous until they're not. By the time policy shifts arrive, momentum is already against them. You can't market your way out of a demographic slide, you can't slogan your way back to trust, and you definitely can't shame people into staying somewhere that no longer feels safe economically or emotionally. The harsh truth is that people don't abandon states. States lose people when they stop providing a believable future. That's the part that never makes it into tourism ads or political speeches. These exits aren't acts of rebellion, they're acts of risk management. Families protecting their kids' prospects, workers protecting their earning potential, retirees protecting their remaining years. And once that framing takes hold, the narrative flips. Staying becomes the risky choice, leaving becomes the rational one. At that point, the question isn't why people are leaving, it's why anyone is surprised. Because mass exits don't start with headlines, they start with hesitation. Then hesitation becomes planning, then planning becomes movement, and by the time the numbers confirm what's happening, the story is already over. The real tragedy isn't that these states are losing people. It's that many of the people leaving wanted to stay. They didn't chase novelty, they chased stability. And when stability stopped being available, they did the only logical thing left. They walked.